Yeah, tell
So,
me about how you got the idea of doing this, because it's really interesting and you had some, really interesting conversations.
oh, thank you so much. I actually had this idea perhaps in March because all of a sudden most of musicians we don't have concerts or live concerts anymore. I know you're still doing a lot of concerts on internet, but
Mm.
for me, I had a little bit sort of like um, moments of like realization. I realized that the reason for me to be a musician is to share uh, something that they think is more human or very sort of personal with others. And I find that through music, I can do that. And I think through conversations, I can also perhaps reach out to people and hopefully give them some sort of like um, comfort or even lighthearted sort of like a moment, I guess. And
Yes. So,
yeah,
and how do you manage to reach out to people, in terms of reach out to your audience? Where did you find your audience?
for me, I particularly sort of uh, sort of I guess choose people first of all like the conversation I've been having are not only just with musicians. There are also scientists. Later on I will interview a friend of mine who's a psychologist. um, so for me the purpose is not just to reach out to, let's say, music lovers. For me, I would love to have more dialogue with people from different area because I think now in our modern time, a lot of things are sort of like very divided, right?
Well, I
Somehow.
mean, this is exactly what makes your series so interesting, that it's not just about musicians complaining that their life sucks.
Thank you. You're very honest. Yeah, I also find that it's sometimes, as musicians, we forget, or in a way, because we're so occupied with our work or life, we forget the true essence of doing that. Sometimes, like our identity is so closely tied to what we do, and somehow we cannot really sort of look at the work objectively speaking, right? And by reaching out to people from different area, I realized, oh, perhaps everyone has the similar sort of approach with their own identities.
Mm.
And I think that can perhaps maybe make some sort of bridge between, I guess, different communities. Um,
Yes, I mean, I love what you say, because I always felt also that, I guess, because I come from a background and from an education which is not really centered in music, I always thought that it was a bit frustrating to see how people seem to define themselves in this branch of activity based on what they do in their work, which
exactly.
is, of course, in some ways inspiring and motivating that they believe so much in their work. But in another way, it's also, as I say, frustrating because the world is so much wider.
Exactly.
And the problem then comes, especially with many people I'm sure we both know, who think that by glorifying music, and they're actually glorifying themselves.
Thank you so
And
much for being
music
so
is
honest.
just a small part of the world, and somehow I would wish that everybody had the chance to see what I've seen and to study what I've studied. Not that I had any promise of being a let's say an accomplished scientist. I could have made my living, okay, but I would not have really made a big contribution, in my opinion. But still, to be able to have this chance of studying it, of seeing what real scientists do,
Mhm.
and just to be able to sort of dabble in so many different fields, it's really something I would wish upon everybody.
Exactly. Thank you so much. So I remember that you mentioned you pursued pure mathematics, right? Uh, can you please share some of your academic background? Because we know you, Kit, as this remarkable artist, performing artist, and also composer. But I think rarely people know too much about the other side of you, the scientific background.
Oh, yes, I think that's as it should be, because of course, nowadays, ever since, for about almost 10 years now, I have been out of that loop. But I guess I'll recount a bit the history of the things that I did in this previous life.
Mhm,
So my first big passion was natural science,
mhm,
chemistry and physics, especially. And I had the incredible luck to have had a good a good approach to the local university,
mhm,
who allowed me to take classes there. Sometimes just listening in, and sometimes actually participating.
mhm,
And eventually, this passion sort of shifted a little bit towards the more abstract side. So I went into pure mathematics.
mhm,
I studied at Imperial College in London in their pure mathematics program, which was really a incredibly inspiring thing, because these were people who lived so far inside their own world of abstract mathematics that they couldn't figure out if 27 was a prime number. I mean, literally, I heard this conversation in one of the hallways, and it started that, well, let's take any prime number. And the other guy said, 27. Wait a minute, is 27 prime? I have no idea. And they were so obsessed with this kind of abstraction and thought, and uh, basically a kind of, you could say, philosophical logic that this
mhm,
kind of mathematics is about. That these reality related things just were not important anymore. And then I guess for some personal reasons, I had to leave London, and I went to Paris, and I pursued my education there. I got a master's from the University of Pierre et Marie Curie,
mhm,
which at the time was called that. Now it's called Sorbonne.
mhm.
And that was 2012, I think. And
Wow.
then after that, I sort of became lazy and just
No, you're never
decided to
lazy.
pursue. Well, but wouldn't you agree with me that music, at least, is something that is in a way very good for slightly lazy people, because it gives you instant gratification. Whether if you're doing something that's not music, if that's not a performing art,
Mhm,
you cannot just do something that you already know and feel a great sense of accomplishment. In music, you can. You play a piece you know, you play it, you listen to something you like, and it
mhm.
makes you feel good immediately, even if you've already done that.
Wow, this is your sense of laziness. Then I guess perhaps you're right. I so talking about um, science, I was wondering because nowadays the world sort of always divide things easily: science versus art, reason versus let's say creativity or sentiment. So for you who actually embody both elements, the scientific training you had, also like your artistic way of perceiving the world, these two elements, um, to me, they're actually not so different from each other. But I guess for many other people outside of the art world, they somehow cannot really see that. Can you please maybe enlighten people a little bit?
Well, I think there is, of course, science in art, but the way that people perceive art does not generally take that into account. I would say that, for example, in music, let's talk about that because it's what we know really
Mhm.
intimately.
Mhm.
When you hear composition, what you hear are emotions. It's also what you're trained to hear.
Mhm.
Music appreciation class is about trying to put into poetic or fake poetic language what a piece of music is sort of trying to say.
Mhm.
And we focus so much in music on that kind of perception
Mhm.
that we actually don't realize that a composer is maybe thinking 80% of the time about something else. Of
Mhm.
course, he is thinking about the kind of literal allusions or the kind of images that he wants to put into his music, but that takes 5 seconds.
Mhm.
Uh, the rest of the time of actually composing is a much more scientific process, I would say.
You know this better than many other, musicians because you yourself is a great composer. Um, so, can you perhaps share some of your process of creating music on top of the fact that you just mentioned about this very scientific way of looking at music?
I guess I could say that there is a sort of an analogy between composing and mathematics, and as well as between performing in terms of interpreting and natural science. Because in performing in classical music, we have that which is the composition at the base,
Mhm.
which you don't change, basically. And that's like the reality we're trying to describe.
Yes.
And natural science is trying to make reality comprehensible to human language, to the human mind. It's about seeing what exists in the world
Mhm.
and explaining it in a
Mhm.
way that we can understand and that we can make use of.
Mhm.
Just like performing a piece of music is about explaining that piece of score in a
Mhm.
way that we can orally enjoy it and understand it. And composing is like mathematics because it's about finding something interesting. It's about creating a world which may or may not exist,
Mhm.
which has some kind of interesting property.
Mhm.
And well, there's a joke about mathematicians. It says there's a very long paper, and the first page is all definitions. And on
Mhm.
the second page, it says, in this paper, we will now look at what happens in the world of functions that satisfy all these criteria. And then it goes on and on to say, if it satisfies all these criteria, then it actually does something really interesting, and you can apply it to this, that, and the other.
Mhm.
And then the last sentence um, with a star, the asterisk, and at the very bottom it says, it is absolutely obvious that there are no functions that satisfy these criteria. So what I mean is mathematics is about creating
Yeah.
something and just following your
Uh-huh.
thoughts to see if it
Uh-huh.
leads to something interesting. And that's like composing.
Mhm.
Of course, you can compose anything you want,
Mhm.
but the point of composing something is to create a kind of inner logic within a piece,
Mhm.
and of which you're writing all of the notes.
Mhm.
You want to create this logic that makes something interesting.
Mhm. Wow, this is fascinating. So my next question is, since you have that process of sort of exploring a world of unknown or a world of um, sort of like you are basically creating something that's absolutely abstract, right? And then later on, when you interpret it, maybe other composers' work, how do you sort of maybe incorporate some of that mindset with your approach in recreating music?
Well, I think at some level, classical music is also made of personalities. It's not just about whether music is good or bad. I think one interprets a piece of music also based on one's own feelings and one's own personality.
For
And
sure.
that's maybe where it's a little bit different, but not entirely different from science. Because, of course, by choosing the topic in science that you're researching, that's also very much a reflection of your personality. It's a
Wow.
reflection of what you think is interesting in the world, of what you think is useful and what you think is motivating. I guess in music, because performing also has a mechanical aspect, which is unfortunately the only aspect that so many people see. So we, in our normal professional lives, often play pieces where, well, tell me if you think this is true. We often play pieces where we are just serving because of our ability to play our instruments. We don't actually have much to say about the piece itself, but we know that we can play it well because it tells us what to do, and it gives us a recipe that we have the technique to be able to follow.
This is something very unique because obviously, this is most of the conservative training, right? We are the server. We are sort of like a remarkable soldiers trying really hard to obey all the rules and what to do, what not to do. However, this is not personally my understanding of how to, let's say, bring music alive. I mean, obviously there are lots of restrictions, but it's for me, obviously, unfortunately, I am not a composer. So the only thing I can have fun with all the rules are how to try to find freedom within this kind of world of rules and
Well, yes, of course, and that's exactly the answer to this really interesting topic. I think about what it's like to come to a piece of music from a composer's point of view. It's because, as you say, let's get away from this conservatory training of figuring out what are rules and how to follow them. Let's really try to understand how a piece works on its own terms. And let's try to make a personal connection to the piece in the same way as you would choose a research topic. As in, you
exactly.
want to find something new about it. You want to see what it is about this that can change your worldview and what it is in your worldview which might be able to contribute to that.
That's really beautifully said. So talking about that part, because I actually followed your YouTube channel and also your social media. I have to say that I really appreciate basically your integrity, not only just the way how you sort of presenting music, but the way how you sort of introduce the elements of like the beauty or the personal elements that you find very fascinating to wider audience. This is very rare. I mean, to me, actually, I think it's very rare in our modern time. So my next question is, I mean, obviously we know that you are just a remarkable, musician and artist. So you're really amazing at what you're doing. On top of the fact that you find curiosity in this, making or creating art for yourself, what else do you find very sort of interesting or in a way motivate you to keep doing that every single day?
Well, okay. I guess this is it's many different questions in one.
Oh,
Let me start with the last one. Yes,
okay.
What motivates me to keep doing this every day? Well, I guess it gets back to this instant gratification thing I was mentioning. Music is, and it should be, instant gratification. I am more and more convinced of that. I actually thought maybe 10 years ago that one day I would no longer want music to be instant gratification, that I would have sort of felt what music could bring, and that I would actually be only interested in the intellectual aspect, or let's say the exploratory aspect of new
Uh-huh.
music.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess in the end, music is a bit like food. Something that's really tasty, you will still want to eat it again. And it's not like something where once you've experienced it, you don't need to experience it anymore. And I think that is realizing this is something that makes me at least partially think that I'm not wasting my time by doing the same thing every day. I mean, of course, you can also look at this in a completely different way. I'm 28 now, and when I was, I don't know, 20, I would never think that, for 8 whole years of my life, I want to do for a living something that involves trying to make other people like the way I play the piano. And that's not my goal. And
Mm-hmm.
it never should sound like a childhood dream, right? Put that way.
Mm-hmm.
But music itself gives this gratification and the realization that I'm able to enjoy it wholeheartedly, and that I'm able to share it and to bring this knowledge, or let's say bring this world of feeling that classical music has, but
Mm-hmm.
which maybe it needs a little bit of knowledge to be unlocked to other people,
Mm-hmm.
is something that I find very motivating.
Wow, that's very, very true. Um, very. Would you say that you also get some of these sort of way of thinking from your mentor? Because I mean, I also watched a lot of sort of. I think you also interviewed him a while ago, right? In January. Um, Something about you were talking about um, you no longer probably imitate him as an artist, and you sort of started to find out your own sort of voice and characteristic. I mean, we as artists, we always try to find out our own identities, to do this kind of search of making music every day, because part of our identity, in music, is also a reflection of who we are. So first of all, I wonder, maybe we can go back a little bit, because I know that you speak perfect Chinese. You also speak uh, German and French fluently, I believe. I don't know how many other languages you speak. So you obviously are someone, I would say maybe perhaps more like a modern resonance, like a Renaissance man, because you know a lot of different culture, you know lots of aspects in the world, not just music. So I mean, that's a really long question. I wonder how you see yourself, like how much of these elements, also with the sort of mentorship from Mr. Brendel, and how would you characterize like you as a person, um, or that part. Sorry, it's a really long question. So how
It's okay. I'm not a professional
Yeah, I'm
interviewee,
not a
so you don't have to
professional
be a
interview.
professional
I
interviewer.
have the problem of just keep going and going, and I don't know how to end my question. But yeah, if I can maybe make it shorter, how much of these elements contribute to your artistry?
Let's see. So I guess my approach to music and my approach to art have not always been the same thing. I think art is something that I did not appreciate when I started with music. For me, music was in the beginning, first of all, what this linguist Steven Pinker said is auditory cheesecake, meaning something that something that sort of hits all the right spots for biochemical reasons, but actually uh, it does not really respond to the core causes of why it is beneficial to an organism to have these things hit all the right spots. Well, that was my enjoyment of music. It was a kind of diversion in which I was able to be creative. When I play video games, I also like to see what is possible in changing the game and to see if that makes the game a bit more interesting or less interesting. Of course, it always makes it less interesting because the game developers were asking themselves exactly the same question and they had answered it before. But still, it's this kind of curiosity that drove me also to pursue music. And it's maybe only later, let's say in the last 10, 15 years, that I realized that music is art. What I mean by art in this sense, I mean in a very narrow sense, is that it expresses what it means to be human and not just uh, tries to entertain the average human. So I guess this must have come in some part through the people I have had the chance of working with, of um, observing, and of getting to know. First and foremost among them, Alfred Brendel, who is, of course, somebody who absolutely comes from the world of art. You might, I guess many people think of him as a kind of hermetic musician, but he is absolutely not. He is, I think, the very definition of what you called Renaissance man in terms of being uh, deeply affected, knowledgeable, and opinionated about every kind of art. So nowadays, I must say that one of my greatest pleasures is looking at art, especially looking at classic painting in museums. And that has, of course, absolutely changed the way that I look at music, because I see that music is born firstly of the same culture. The music that we are dealing with in our professional lives is basically European music between 1500 and 1900. And that is the core of what we do. And it's also the core of this great tradition of painting.
Would you enlighten us with sort of like the correlation, how you see, visual art versus, like our sort of, it's audio sort of based. I mean, sorry, my English. So the visual element is perhaps, I mean, I think we sort of can see the correlation, but maybe it's not as easy for maybe people outside of music world to see the similarity of approaching art.
Mm-hmm. Yes, of course. The first thing you really see are the differences, right? In music, if you don't like a piece of music, you can't just look away. It keeps playing, and it takes time. And the experience of listening to music is a bit different from looking at art. I don't know. It's a strange thing that I always felt that music is much more immediate and accessible than art. But maybe it's because I came to it first, because I know many people who say that art for them is accessible and music, especially modern music, just doesn't say anything to them. Well, be that as it may, I think one of the great similarities is that at the base, there is a core of what you could even call a little bit scientific, which is about aesthetics. It's about what the human mind is pre-programmed either by nature or by culture to find beautiful and attractive. And I think one of the things that it finds attractive is structure. This sounds terribly mathematical and unartistic, but it's not, because it is really what makes art worthwhile and enjoyable.
For sure.
It's that it gives us something that we can latch onto, meaning that we can understand in such a way that we can make predictions. We can see patterns, and these patterns suggest ways of continuing themselves to the person who's listening or the person who's watching, who's looking. When these patterns are then modified in certain ways, then we get a kind of satisfaction, or we get a kind of suspense, which makes us want to keep looking. It's in a way just a very human thing
Right.
that is both in visual art and in audio art.
And it's also storytelling. For with my experiences, I think I often see art as like sort of a maybe condensed way, or sometimes it can be shortened way for people to perceive life itself, because it's like dream. When we are dreaming, we don't really see the time and space becomes very different. I see art is sort of like similar to that aspect of human imagination. So we all have a sense of existence, like how we function in life, how we perceive ourselves or others or the world. And that emotional aspect sometimes can be neglected in daily life. But through art, we somehow can sort of maybe recapture that element. And it's the same thing
I think
with
one of the things that really art is great at doing, and music as well, is encapsulating a lot from our emotional experience into one thing, whether it be a thing that you see or a thing that you hear. And I would say that when we neglect these things in daily life, and I absolutely do, and I don't think I have ever felt the way that the Sixth Symphony of Tchaikovsky feels, but I guess I can sort of understand what that is, and it does enrich my emotional experience, even if I'm not sure I ever want to feel like that myself.
Yeah, it's also another way of exploring the emotional capacity that we have on top of the intellectual sort of part of music making. And I think very last question, because I know you're really busy. You're still making music every day for us. I think you're always very sort of curious, right? Curious about a lot of things in life in general, and I'm sure that's also part of the reason that you're so good at what you do. And I just, as a human being, when you're not learning, or because I know that you're very curious about art and languages, culture. Um, what do you do that makes you feel life is meaningful, basically?
Hmm.
When you're not making music, basically.
Yeah, I wonder, do you think that this answer is fundamentally different between is fundamentally so different between different people? I mean, I
Yeah,
guess
it's
if you
quite different because my previous sort of interviews, I always ask everyone that question, and yeah, I guess obviously it depends on age group and also like personalities. Um, yeah, because I think that answer that's not universal, or each individual sort of decide, because you have to have that decision, right? To tell yourself, okay, this is something that I find very rewarding, or gives me satisfaction, or gives me some sort of like a purpose. And then once people decide, life becomes richer than before. So I mean, yeah, I do wonder. Obviously, you're still searching, and you're very, young, and I still think it's very interesting to know how people think about this question.
well, I think starting at the very basic, I am, and we are all human, right? And humans have, I think, universally some things that they really love doing, like eating tasty food. I think that's,
Yeah, you're a big
well,
food lover, yes. I know.
so yes, I mean, that definitely makes me feel alive. And that is one of these things that sort of gives a moment meaning, right? And I'm not just talking narrowly about a particular thing that you eat, but also just about the idea of experiencing something that goes through the senses and
Mhm,
which gives you a real um, corporal and visceral joy.
mhm,
I think in some cases music can do that too. Um, it probably does that more to people who don't, who have not looked so closely and so deeply into the way music works.
mhm.
It's possible. And somebody has once told me that you know I should never learn to paint, because if I learn to paint, then so many of the paintings that I love for reasons I cannot understand, I will not love anymore. Well, I don't know. But okay, so that's one level. I guess the other thing which gives my life meaning
Mhm,
is to be able to imagine, is to put myself into another world,
mhm,
to create my own reality in a way that I can inhabit it in whichever time frame and in whichever state of mind that I wish. I guess this is absolutely what one could call a luxury problem. I don't think I don't think everybody in the world thinks that this is important, but I
No,
have
I
had
think
the
it's
good
fundamentally
fortune.
important. I think it is fun. Yeah, you use the word to imagine, but I think we all have to have that. I think it's perhaps more to do with psychology, because when we talk about imagination, somehow we associate with maybe art, or things are not real. But the thing is, we are all very subjective, and each individual, we see the world completely in a different way. And um, I believe that I mean, maybe I'm not a psychologist, but I do find it's fascinating that in different, sort of methods, I think they often sort of get layers of different consciousness, right? So, whether it's like in the, maybe it's a little bit outdated, but people like Carl Jung, for example, always talk about, you know, collective consciousness versus like subconsciousness. I mean, I mean, maybe it's more of a philosophical approach rather than a psychological approach. But I do find that it's very important for all of us to have that very individual approach of how to perceive the world, or perceive us, most importantly, because we don't really know who we are. You know, I mean, I'm actually interviewing you, but I think perhaps like both of us, we're trying to figure out what we really want to say, or what we really feel, or how
And that's
they're
what
really
happens when
true.
you interview people. That's what happens when you interview people you know.
Yeah, so I think, you know, I totally agree with you. I think it is very, very crucial for us um, to discover in a maybe a different world. That's not to say that, you know, imagination or anything it's abstract is not real. It's actually really real. Because how can we say that the you know the things that we see every day is the truth? We I mean, you know, it's even for scientists, you know, you cannot really prove that everything we perceive is truth, right? It's, you have to prove. And
Yes, I think what you're getting at is also that our currency, when we're talking to each other, when we're thinking about the world, we're not actually talking about the world. We're not actually talking about. We're not actually, yes, sharing the world with each other. What we are is sharing a mental construct of it.
exactly.
And this mental construct is something that I suppose you could say is a concept in and of itself. And what we are saying is that this concept is a very valuable thing. And it's
Thank
not just a kind of proxy for reality, but
you.
actually uh, what we should be really investigating and where we're really living is inside this collective concept.
Wow, thank you for translating for me. Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to say. But as you can tell, I'm pretty horrible with language. Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to say. And I really, uh, you know, I really appreciate that you know you are here and talking about your sort of experiences with imaginations, with art. I think it is really beautiful to hear someone who understands, you know, both elements like the science and art. For me, it's also a learning process, because I mean, I've been your, I think, fan for many years. I always follow your work, and I find you truly, truly inspiring in our time. And for me, it is also very interesting to know what elements actually make you to be such a remarkable artist. And I think it proves that really, like, you know, art really comes from so many different things. You know, it's not just, you know, something that you can put it in a separate box or whatever, and then hopefully that will become really, really, you know, profound. You know, art really is everything. Music is everything. It comes from so much.
Well, yes, I mean, I think absolutely both of us, we would say, we would agree with this, that art comes from so many different sources, and that it's really, and the point is not to create art in the sense of music being an audio file. The point is really to encompass the human experience. But I guess just to be a little bit subversive, isn't there a whole sequence of examples in the history of art of people who somehow bypassed this whole area of thought and just somehow intuitively tapped into something which, in the eyes of everyone else, um, managed to encompass the whole of humankind. I mean, I guess the headline quote is this famous quote from Terence, right? I am human, therefore nothing that is human can be foreign to me. The point being that it is sufficient just to be human. You don't, one doesn't have to consciously investigate all these things.
Uh-huh.
Just by existing, one is already experiencing all that. Well, I mean, of course, you don't agree, I don't agree, as far as I can tell. But it happened, right? And I think the painter Hokusai, the Japanese painter, as far as I know, he was not really an intellectually curious scholar. He was simply interested in painting, and painting was an obsession.
Mhm.
And when you look at his works through the painting, you see a whole intelligence, and you see a whole library of historical allusions and all these things, which seem to be conscious, but actually are subconscious. And I'm sure it happened in music too. I'm not sure exactly which example you think would be the best in music to say that, but what do you think?
You know, for me, I'm always fascinated by lives of composers, for example. But rarely I find, extraordinary composers who don't really have any other curiosities. If you look at any of those, yeah. I, but I mean, on the other hand, I do wonder, for performers, people who recreate their music. There's a certain tendency of whether it's because of education or the mindset of really just separate themselves from the process of creating something for others. People in the performing art world tend to be a little bit less open-minded, or I think perhaps, I don't know, what do you think? You're very different because you have the capacity to do so many things in life. But perhaps the physical element of executing pieces of music probably takes a lot of time for many people, and perhaps as a result they don't have enough maybe space for some other inspiration anymore. I don't know. What do you think? Yeah, this is something that I find a little bit frustrating. Well, sometimes even when I talk to very, very established performing artists, some of them they have this sort of mindset that in order to be fantastic performing artist, musician, you don't have any time for other things because you have to just be fully indulged in whatever you do to be excellent at it. Yeah, that kind of mentality is, maybe it's not common, but it's there in music world.
Yeah, I've definitely been in rehearsals where I hear somebody playing something incredibly beautifully, and maybe there will be some detail that I think is just absolutely inspired. And I would just think to myself, how did he know to play that note softly? How did he know that in that moment that was the right thing to do? And I would think, yes, I mean, you can think of all these different examples in the history of art. Also, if you look at color shading in this particular painting that I saw in this museum, you see that they use exactly the same kind of concept. And if you think of this, I don't know, this passage in Shakespeare, you will see that he actually had the exact same aesthetic idea. And this is just something so universal. And you realize, knowing that man, I'm sure he has absolutely no idea why he did that.
This is very funny. Yeah, obviously you cannot say there's one way of doing things, but for me, I do find that when I hear a really remarkable sort of performance, what strikes me most is not how people execute things, right? I mean, I'm not even talking about the technical part, but even like the so-called how people phrase things, how they use different colors. I don't really think these things really personally strike me. Sometimes when I completely forget the fact that I'm actually listening to music, I'm actually like if sort of a really great musician sort of brings me to another world, like what you said, that imagine people should imagine another world. If I feel like I'm in a different space and time, I forget about music, I forget about interpretation, I forget about even this is art, then I that's something that truly touches me. So maybe that's why I often find it's more inspiring to get to hear maybe musicians like you who actually have lots of different perspective, because that actually shows in your playing, I have to say.
This is a really interesting experience that you share about listening to music and forgetting that it's music that you're listening to. And if I understand a bit between the lines, what you mean is that instead of hearing music, what you're hearing is the universal thoughts of that person, and also of a human in general, of what it means to think, and how thoughts work and follow each other, and how they represent what we see and what we feel. Now, I must say that in music, I'm not sure I have this idea or this impression so often when I listen to other people. It's just because I'm a terrible listener in music, unless I'm playing. I think I'm a decent accompanist. Correct me if I'm completely wrong, but I think I can accompany people quite well. But when I'm not playing, then it's just impossible for me to listen to music. So I get my aesthetic pleasure through painting first and foremost, and exactly this kind of feeling I had with this painting. You know the artist, probably 17th century, 18th century, Zheng Banqiao.
Oh yes.
I there's a work of his in New York, in the
Oh.
Metropolitan Museum. It's huge, and it's like, I guess, 1.5 meters or something like that. Let me show it to you. Do you see it?
Oh wow. Yes, wow. It's beautiful. With lots of shades. Yes.
So when I was looking at this, I realized that, just subconsciously, I didn't even know anymore that I was looking at bamboo. What I was looking at was, how do I say, a realization, or what I was looking at was the making into reality of what aesthetics is about. I mean, the idea of why is there a bamboo in this shade, of that shape, in this particular point.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like this painting made me ask that question. Why is it that as a human, separated by many thousands of kilometers and many hundreds of years, I absolutely feel exactly the same thing that the creator of this work of art felt, that it is absolutely right to have that thing right here. I'm sure it's not because he walked out and sort of looked up and say, ah, yes, there is a bamboo. I'm going to draw it right there. There is another one. I'm going to draw it. I think this is something that is a product of his mind. This picture, and the fact that this is something that the human imagination creates based on rules which apparently are absolutely universal. That to me was the most moving thing about this picture.
Wow, this is beautiful. Um, yeah, and you also, I mean, it's remarkable that you you know, have curiosity about you know, ancient Chinese culture, because this is not something it's very common among, you know, not only just classically trained musicians, but also for someone who was, you know, you were raised in, you know, the Western culture, right? So this is actually very remarkable that you have that uh, thirst for knowledge. Yeah, yeah. How did you even first encounter, you know, Chinese painting? I have to say I'm pretty ignorant with my own culture, so.
Oh. Well, there's always time. I mean, yes, I guess when we met for the first time, it was not something that I often thought about. And of course, it was sort of always in the background because I know who I am, I know where I come from, and I know what many people who have been very important to me and for whom I have a great affection and a real interpersonal bond, what they have been very moved by and what they have thought were the greatest things in the world. And I guess one day I discovered for myself that in some way, I also think it's the greatest thing in the world.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm a little bit speechless because you know, it's very rare for me to actually meet people in general who have just, you know, such deep understanding of you know, humanity in some way. And you're really young, but you already, you know, have such profound sort of understanding for everything. So thank you so much for talking to me.
Oh
And
no, I mean, thank
think
you.
this
This is
discussion really.
it's wonderful to catch up again, and thank you so much for doing this. It's really very enriching and stimulating, and
Oh, thank you.
I just wish I had a silver bullet to make everybody in the world see, what you're doing here. And unfortunately, marketing is one of the things I least understand. So
Me neither. But for me, it's you know, I don't think about reaching out to, you know, many people. This is not my goal because it's like concerts. I don't think we have to try really hard to convince everyone to appreciate, you know, music. But if we can,
absolutely,
yeah, if we can just perhaps touch one person in the audience and then change that person's some, you know, perspective, that's, I think it's already really meaningful. And obviously I think, you know, for me and talking to you, it's really like what I said. Obviously I really admire your artistry or your musicianship, but more importantly, it's that you have that thirst for knowledge, for, you know, different aspect in life. That really inspired me. And thank you so much for that. And also, you know, it's really just maybe 1 hour or so, but we really get to hear someone who just is really extraordinary. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
it's great talking to you.
Yeah,
And
and take care, and hopefully, you have lots of time to cook. Maybe now it's time because you don't travel anymore, and we'll keep maybe watching all your performances. Your
yes, and there's one every day. I think I will start putting some more fancy things into them. Some of this is still a bit secret, but there will be some, yes, fancy stuff coming in. I think today there was a cat picture, this lol cat picture. So there will definitely be more of that.
Well, thank you. I can't wait to to watch more of those videos, especially like your the way how you describe music. It's so poetic and it's so right to the point. It's very refreshing and educational as well. So yeah, thank you so much and take care.
Well, you too.
Yeah,
Many greetings to
hopefully one day,
Philadelphia, and
yeah, we get to see each other in Europe somewhere.
yeah, definitely. And we will, of course, keep in touch and let me know whenever your next great idea comes along. It's
Thank you.
probably in 5 minutes, but yes, keep me informed.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Bye.
All the best. Bye bye.
Bye.